So in the last week or so, a trailer for a film has been released, and it's going to come out in May of next year, I believe, and it is a live-action Little Mermaid. And there has been quite a response to the young woman who was cast is being cast as Ariel. I believe her name is Holly Bailey. And I've been really moved to see the images of young girls who themselves are quite moved to see their own representation depicted in Ariel. Ariel is a character in this film who will have black skin. And I've also been disheartened and sad to see the parts of the internet that we might anticipate doing exactly what they do best, which is sort of mixing a toxic sludge of racism and bigotry, and really having an uproar about this cultural representation. And it's also not only on the internet, it's also spilled out into commentary on cable news and that sort of thing. And I find it really disappointing. And I'm thinking about a couple of things with it. One is that I think it would be quite instructive for those people who are truly bothered by that to learn about The Little Mermaid and what its story is and why it was written. It was actually written by Hans Christian Andersen as a love letter to another man. And it was given to this man who was his love, who was about to marry a woman, and this sort of recognition that they could not have that relationship. And spoiler alert, if you have not read The Little Mermaid, you might not know that the ending is not Ariel getting legs and going to marry her love. It's a very, very bitter ending where basically Ariel is given the option of destroying the relationship that the prince has with his soon-to-be wife, or destroying that and then living with him, or her alternative, because it's a fairy tale and she has this curse on her, she will die. And if she doesn't sort of make her choice before the sun rises, she'll be turned into the foam of the sea. And the story ends with her sitting on the bow of the boat watching the sun rise, knowing that she'll die. It's a very, very sad, bitter story. And so, I bring this up because I think that would be an instructive moment for people who are quite wound up about a new representation of the Little Mermaid. Let's be real about what the original intent of the author was. And then the other thing that I'm thinking about here, and really noticing with this, and this ties in with the sermon today, what I want to talk about, is that in a way, we all know that Ariel she's a fantasy character. She doesn't have a historical corollary. There is no material reality to the Little Mermaid. She was a fictional character that was created by Hans Christian Andersen. And so in a way, we know she doesn't have a body to get, there's conversations here about, is this a distortion of the original material or whatever? Well, it's not really, because she's a fictional character. We can reimagine her in lots of different ways. That's what the imagination does. That's what fantasy does. It allows us to imagine things in new ways. But there is an image that is quite indelible, that is imprinted in people's minds about who Ariel is and what she looks like, despite the fact that she doesn't have an actual material physical corollary. And that image is having a deep impact and effect on the conversations that people are having today. And I think a lot that probably goes back to the movie that was made in the 90s by Disney of Ariel and the representation there. Perhaps children had storybooks that they grew up with and saw the same kind of image repeated again and again and again. And that has formed a part of their association with this character. So I'm going to pause on Ariel for now and move on to another important character. So a couple decades ago, broad swath of the American public was interviewed about what they thought God looked like, who they thought God was, what they thought God's body looked like. And what they did is, they just, in the same way that you might take a character sketch at a police station or something, they interviewed people about what are the shape of the eyebrows? What does the hairline look like? What is the skin color? What is the musculature? What is, the shape of the eyes and the nose? And they pulled together all of these images that people had, and they created a composite. They created a composite image. And can anybody guess what the composite image was of? Yeah, a dude, a pretty average looking white dude. Pretty average looking white dude. That's who most people said they thought of when they pictured God. And I'm sure that this was disappointing to many folks. And I'm thinking particularly that, this was a broad swath of the country. It wasn't only fundamentalists or evangelicals, but, these are people who are a part of denominations like the United Church of Christ or the Unitarian Universalist Association or the Episcopal Church, who have given a lot of thought to and attention to changing language and imagery and liturgy about what God looks like. Since at least the 1970s, 1980s, there's been a move in all of these denominations to try to open up and create a more expansive image of who they think God is and what we think God's body looks like. And so there is some sadness that's still lingering in the back of our consciousness, is the image of God as average, middle-aged, white dude. So, maybe that could, it's like, yeah, great, that can be one image of God, but can't we have more than that? The other thing that's really interesting there is that this survey wasn't conducted only with people who believe in God. It also interviewed people who are non-believers. And they too came up with the image of God as average white dude. So what are we to make of this? What I make of it is that there is a solid image that people carry, whether they explicitly articulate it or not, of what God looks like. And I think that has some really important implications. And I want to spend a little bit of time unpacking this. So it's interesting with a character, with God, taking God as a character here, because unlike the Little Mermaid, there's a whole tradition in theology that says we should not represent God. So there are lots of very thoughtful theologians who will give many reasons for why God should not be represented. And this goes back all the way to the Hebrew scriptures at least. And in there, they came up with different rationales for why God should not be represented. But one of the reasons that they gave is that the image of God, if we were to see God, if we were to see the image of God, it would be so searing that it would blind us. We could not fathom the amazing sight of God. And therefore, any representation that we create of God is going to be deeply inadequate. That view traced a lineage throughout the monotheistic traditions, and there is a prohibition on image making in Islam. And then Catholics quite comfortable with images, right? And we even see God depicted in Michelangelo's famous image, where also white dude, reaching down and touching fingers with Adam in order to give Adam life. But when the Protestant Reformation happened, one of its bones of contention was about representation. And so in Northern Europe, images were purged from churches. The word iconoclast means breaker of icons. That word comes from these groups of people who in Northern Europe would go church to church and throw out images of the saints, images of Mary, and also images of God, because they thought that it was a sacrilege to try to represent God. And then we can move forward to today, where you have lots of really articulate theologians who will also give warnings about trying to represent God. Paul Tillich is one of these thinkers who makes a very strong case for that. So that is a very strong tendency in theology, and it's one that I have some respect for, because I think what it is doing is it's saying, be careful of the impulse to think that you are able to represent the totality of all existence. Be humble, human being, be humble. I think there's an important impulse behind that. But that also does nothing to the fact that we still have this image of God as the average white dude. So I was really excited this year. A book came out by Anna Stravakopoulou called God's God, An Anatomy. And she is a scholar of the Hebrew Bible, and she goes back to those texts, and she lifts up the fact that there is a prohibition on image making, and then she spells out all the ways that the Hebrew scriptures detail exactly what God's body looks like. And spoiler alert here, God is a dude. I don't think we can sort of use racial terms at that time, because that's a different context, and race would have meant something very different at that time. But nonetheless, God is depicted as this virile warrior male figure. And so if we're asking about the lineage of where this image comes from, where do we get this image of God as being a white dude? Like, where does that come from? Well, it goes back some ways. It goes back pretty far. And I love the book is so spectacular. It basically goes chapter by chapter, looking at every body part of God, and talking about where that's represented and how it's talked about and what it means. And oftentimes there's muscularity, virility. The arm is depicted. It's always the right hand, because the right hand is the hand that would lift a weapon, right? Footprints are important in this book, because when there was a thing in ancient Hebrew culture, that if you were to walk onto a certain property, it could symbolize that you were taking possession or ownership there. And so there were actually footprints of God in places where people thought God had actually walked, in order to claim ownership of that. And so this is a very particular image of God being this sort of virile, strong man. So how does this affect us today? Now, I'm a religious humanist, as I've talked about before. To me, the language of God doesn't resonate super strongly. I like the language of the sacred a bit more. For me, the sacred is more about the ascription of ultimate value that we give to things in the world, a little more depersonalized than the language of God. But nonetheless, I would say that the language around God very much affects us in the same way. I was like thinking, what's a good parallel for how this continues to affect us, even if we are religious humanists, even if we are feminists, even if we are people who articulate very explicitly a different idea of what God may look like, or that God doesn't even exist. It's like, what's a good parallel? Beauty standards, beauty ideals. We may very explicitly repudiate the idea that someone's worth is attributable to how they appear, to what their body looks like, to how closely they approximate a random cultural association that we have with attractiveness. And nonetheless, we may at some point start to judge ourselves or judge other people because of how much they line up with those ideals. It operates at a subconscious level. And so I think that wherever we are on the theological spectrum, we all have a stake in breaking open our understanding of who God is, what God looks like, what God's body looks like. And Anna Stavrakopoulos is not the first to talk about this, and I am deeply inspired by some of the early feminists who were writing about this. Mary Daly is one. She wrote a fantastic book called Beyond God the Father, and in Beyond God the Father, she has this line that I think is just breathtaking in its compactness, the way that it puts all of this into just the simplest phrase. She says, if God is male, then the male is God. What she is saying is, if we have that association lingering in our heads, then we are going to value men and male bodies and put them into positions of privilege and power more so than we are willing to do with other people. The same for race, the same for intersex people, the same for transgender people, the same for anyone who falls outside of that patriarchal masculinist ideal. And so we all have a stake in breaking this open. And so how do we break it open? Well, I think there's two things. One is that I would lift up our Unitarian Universalist proclivity and valuation of plurality. We celebrate traditions from around the world. We do not only need to look to the Western monotheistic tradition in order to be inspired by images of the divine. We can look to other traditions that have lifted up deities that are female, some of them very fierce female deities, that have lifted up male deities that have been surprisingly tender and have a very different association with masculinity than we might have. There are other traditions that have deities that are intersex. Famously, Shiva from the Hindu tradition is an intersex deity. And then we can even look at traditions that expand beyond humans, right? There are many traditions that look to animals as representing the divine. And in a culture that treats animals so poorly, with something like factory farming, I think that is an important contribution for how we might reinscribe value. And then a last one that I'll mention is Sally McFaig. She is a phenomenal theologian, and she wrote a book called The Body of God. And she is an eco-theologian. For her, the body of God is the earth itself. And her invitation is for us to ascribe value to all of life, to all of the world, to be attentive to all human beings, all animals, and all of nature that we encounter. And what a powerful impulse that is. And so as I wrap up today, I'd like to think about how is it that we can change what we value. I think that's a hard question. It's a hard nut to crack, because that image that we have inherited through millennia continues to linger for so many of us, even though we are very thoughtful people, even though we have come to different conclusions about what the divine might look like, and we criticize the idea of God as being sort of the average white dude. Well, one of my friends is an artist, and she talks about how when she got into art, she always wanted to paint the most bodies at sort of their most supple and sort of ideal form. So she always painted like 25-year-olds who were very thin and muscular and had beauty standards that were very exact. And she had a very narrow idea of what that looked like. And eventually she said that she realized that she had gotten bored. She had gotten bored. And so she started to invite people with very different bodies to come and sit for her as she painted them. And what she discovered is that in painting these people with very different bodies and very different abilities, and just that fell farther and farther outside of kind of cultural standards of beauty, she began to appreciate new beauty that she discovered in those people who came to sit for her. She began to cultivate an appreciation of beauty that was much more expansive than what she had started with. And I think that's a discipline, it's an intention, it's something that we have to continue to be mindful of, but I do have faith that we can begin to open up our ideas of who God is, what the divine is, and move in a more imaginatively expansive direction in much the same way that God may have sat down at that beauty school and lifted up that person's hands, admiring the intricacy of the bones, the delicacy of the fingernails, painting every nail a different color and saying, yes, that is beautiful.